So I'm from Sweden. I live in Stockholm. Originally, I was born in and raised in the south of Sweden, a town called Lund, a university city. It's the very secular part of Sweden. And I was born into a warm Christian Evangelical family. So we studied the Bible, we prayed together. My father was a lay preacher, a lot involved in ministry. So when I grew up, the faith was really natural. And as a child, of course, you affirm what's in your family. But I was not that old when I realized, wow, what a strange family I've come to. No one else believes in this stuff. What's going on here? None of my friends, none in my class, none as far as I know, knew on the whole school. I'm sure there were a few Christians, but not many. I felt like an alien. What on earth is this? I know it's really important for us. I know it's been in my family for generations with missionaries and pastors. And I think I've been in contact with God. I felt God calling me. But is this just sociology? Is it just psychology? I couldn't formulate it that way. But my mind was going in that direction. What is this? And because of the person I am, the whole issues of truth became really important. If this is not true, this thing in my family, it will end with me. I cannot continue with this if it's not real. So that's actually the personal background for me in terms of apologetics, the truth questions. And in God's mercy, people come alongside me. I have had a very open-minded father. We could discuss a lot of things, so he helped me. But especially it was the books by Francis Schaeffer that became a real eye-opener for me. And even though I at the time didn't understand a lot of things he was writing about, what I understood was really, really profound for me and gave me an opening to affirm the Christian faith more holistic, not only as an experience of God calling me, but also affirming it with my mind and seeing that this is actually related not only to my experience, but to reality, the reality that everyone shares with me. We are on the same planet. We belong to the same humanity. This speaks into this world. So in my teenage years, the writing of Francis Schaeffer, of C.S. Lewis, became very important. I married young, married Ingrid. We have been married for 36 years. We have 3 grown-up children. We've had 3 weddings in a row, 3 summers. So for the first summer in 4 years, no wedding. So it's been great summers and a great joy to see your children marrying. I've been involved in student work, student ministry, student evangelism most of my life within the Swedish IFES movement. I've worked with persuasive evangelism from an apologetic point of view. I've also been involved quite a lot on social issues in my role within the Swedish Evangelical Alliance. So I've been publicly discussing and debating a lot of controversial issues in Sweden. And the bios you heard is actually, it's not fully up to date. I have recently changed some of my ministry, so I now work full-time for an apologetic ministry called apologia, from the Greek word, or the Greek word, apologia, which is behind apologetics. Apologia, Center for Christian Apologetics. So we are focusing wholeheartedly on helping the churches to develop apologetic ministries and to do persuasive evangelism, public presentations of the gospel from an apologetic perspective, where you are dialoguing and reasoning and arguing about those issues. Ingrid and I, we live in Stockholm. We have lived there since the 90s, so that's my base. Well, yeah, that was something about me. I happen to be a huge Woody Allen fan, not about what's going on in his personal life, but I do really like his movies. So if anyone of you are a Woody Allen fan, I'm happy to discuss his movies. Okay, let's go over to the subject. The Lordship of Christ over all of life, how we use our minds. And the outline you have in your app is actually Andrew Fellow's outline. Andrew Fellows is a teacher from many years from English Library, now from Christian Heritage. So that is the outline he used when he was speaking about the same subject in this network. I will give my own presentation, so unfortunately I will not follow that outline precisely. I'm not copying his talk, but we have the same perspective, so you will recognize a lot of things. The Lordship of Christ over all of life, how we use our minds. The Lordship of Christ, the confession Jesus is Lord, is so crucial for us as Christians. It has been like that from the beginning. The first Christians were living in a culture with a relative religious freedom. You could choose your own gods, you could choose your own religion, you could express your spirituality as long as you partook in an official ceremony in front of witnesses and you proclaimed Kyrios Caesar. Caesar is Lord. And that was the only thing the Christians couldn't do, because their confession was Kyrios Jesus. Jesus is Lord. That is the shortest and one of the oldest Christian confessions. Jesus is Lord. And you can see in the New Testament how central this is. It's connected to how we are saved. In Romans 10 verses 9, Paul says, if you declare with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So that's how we are saved. We confess Jesus as Lord, not just as a verbal formula, but honestly. So our heart, it's connected with our hearts, believing what God has done through Jesus, that he has been raised and elevated to Lord of all. And this is how we confess that history will end, that everyone will give this acknowledgement. Jesus Christ is Lord. Every tongue will acknowledge. So this is absolutely crucial. Jesus Christ is Lord. You cannot have a Christian faith without that confession. And it follows, of course, if Jesus is Lord, Lord above Caesar, Lord above all other religions and philosophies and ideas, Lord above all other powers and structures, this follows, and this is a well-known formulation. If Jesus Christ is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. You cannot choose to have a confession, Jesus is Lord, and then sector your life and say, and what I mean is, he's the Lord over this. He's the Lord. And that lordship must cover everything. He is elevated over everything. He's Lord of the universe. So if we understand the Christian confession, Jesus is Lord, this follows that then he must be Lord of all. And if he's just Lord of partially, we have not actually confessed him as Lord. That has a lot of implications for a lot of areas, of course. And today we are going to deal with the implication, what about our mind? Having Christ as Lord of our minds. A very well-known book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, by Mark Knoll. It begins with this famous sentence. It's a very depressing sentence. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind. We have not exercised the Lordship of Christ over our minds, our thinking, our ideas. You could say that's true also over other areas, so I'm not saying this is the only area where there's a problem, but this is an area where there is an obvious, real problem. The Lordship of Christ over our minds. Now, why has that happened? Why have we, as evangelical Christians, being so slow and weak in applying the Lordship of Christ to our thinking? Is it possible to understand why has this happened? So I will put some time into trying to understand that, because I think that is helpful if we then are going to solve this problem, starting to move in a more in a better direction. I've been teaching students for many years, and I often have made this exercise. I've said, let's think about spirituality. What is your association? If I write spirituality here, and I often have given people a lot of pens, write your association. I say the word spirituality, fill the board with your association. What kind of words will there be on the board? Well, here is a standard. If I have 25 students and I ask them, write your association to the word spirituality. It's about the soul. It's of course about the spirit. It's about the invisible. It's something emotional. It has to do with the inner life of a human being. It relates to the unknown. It's deeply personal. It borders to mysticism. It has to do with openness and relates to our longing for God. Okay? So here you have a word cluster. So people think, a spiritual life, what is that? Well, something in that direction. If you think like that, your mind is of course not very much involved. So to develop a spiritual life, it's not the mind. It affects other dimensions of our human reality, but not our thinking. This has unfortunately been a strong trend within Christians, and for a long time. This is, in Swedish, Simon Pelarhelgonet. Simeon the Stylitz, is that the right pronunciation? Anyhow, he is a Syriac ascetic and saint. I don't know if the war has destroyed it, but before the war, you could visit the place where he became famous. He climbed a pillar and lived upon the pillar for 37 years without coming down. And he stood up with his hands raised and prayed, and he fell down on his knees and prayed. And he did that for 37 years. And people were extremely expressed, so they were flocking around the pillar. And then he could also preach from the pillar. And you see here is an icon. So that's food coming up and water coming up to him. You cannot live up there for 37 years without people serving you with some water and food. And that is the result of eating and drinking coming down. And he was greatly admired. He was such an holy man, so he could live on a pillar for 37 years. That's an interesting view of a spiritual life. Of course, it expresses an enormous devotion to God. I'm not denying that. But it is also raises a lot of questions. Is this an ideal spiritual life? How to think about what is spirituality? If we widen our picture and look at other philosophies and religions, we can easily see it's a general tendency within humanity that if people are searching, they tend to search beyond this world. Let me give you two examples. One Western philosophical and one Eastern religious. The philosophy of Plato. Here you have these famous painting, the School of Athens. You have Plato and Aristotle. Plato is the one pointing upwards and Aristotle pointing downwards. Plato's philosophy is that he's dividing the world into a dualism. So you have this world, the material world where we are living now, time-space continuum, the material world, and then you have the ideal world. And that is the good. That is the really real world. And the direction is that we should move from this physical world to this world of ideas, from this world of shadows to the world of ideas, the ideal world. We ourselves are torn into this dualism. So we have a body which belongs to this lower world, the shadow world, and then we have a soul which is connected to the world of ideals. And we should have a direction in our lives away from this world towards the world of the ideals, away from the body to release the soul. He is a rationalist in terms of how he thinks of his mind, but the highest knowledge for Plato is not the rational thought. There is a mystic apprehension, which is the highest level of knowledge. So you should even move beyond thinking. If we go to the East, the most obvious example here is the Buddha. And he is identifying the whole problem for us as human beings is attachment to this world. Is the longing for life in this world, and we attach to this world. And that is what's caused suffering. And the way to reduce suffering is to reduce attachment. So we should be disattached to this world and become neutral. Have you noticed that on statues, Buddha is closing his eyes? That's very typical, because this world is not important. You should not take in this world, because that you will become attached to what you see, and then you will be imprisoned in this world of suffering. So Buddha is closing his eyes. Just at this moment, let me just point out what a contrast with Jesus Christ. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion with them because they were harassed and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd. So Jesus was living in this world, taking it in with its suffering, seeing people, and then reaching out and touching their bodies. So what's the point here? The point here is the direction. People think to find the ideal world, to find release from suffering, to find a spiritual way, the direction is away from this world. I may tell a story here. When a number of years ago, I was speaking at a huge student conference, an IFS conference in Aschaffenburg. 2,000 students at least were gathered. I was the speaker for the first evening. And as usual on big conferences, the speaker was filmed and projected on two huge screens on both sides behind the speaker. And I always use PowerPoint, so I had prepared a PowerPoint, and I've sent it to them. And my introduction to the sermon was to talk about what I've just said to you, the direction away from this world, how religion and philosophies very often are moving people away from this actual reality. And I had put up as a first point, a summary of this. Now the problem for me was that this was the first evening I didn't know how they were going to use it. I just assumed that when the PowerPoint bullets are coming up, the cameras are closing down for a few minutes, so people see the PowerPoint bullets, and then that did not happen. Because what they did were they were filming the speaker all the time, and then the PowerPoint bullet were coming above the head of the speaker. And above, a gigantic picture of my face, my first bullet point came up, the ugly face of religion. And there were like 100 Swedes at the conference. They totally collapsed in laugh. And someone, of course, had a digital camera and took a picture of that and opened a website in Sweden, the ugly face of religion. So that's part of my identity. Okay, let's forget about Aschaffenburg. I'm happy to do that. What I've described in Platonism and Buddhism also have strong influences within the Christian faith. You think of different Christian traditions, like the Desert Fathers that Simeon de Styglet is part of, Christians who really wanted to show their commitment. They left the cities, went out to live in the deserts in prayer and meditation. You can think of the mystic tradition within Christianity. Now, I'm not saying everything is wrong here. There's a lot of things to be said here. I'm just pointing out the kind of direction how people think. And normal Christians were thinking of, oh, they are the saints. They have moved away from normal life and devoting themselves to Christ in this way. In a number of those traditions, that's the background for us, like the Pietism in the 18th and 19th century Europe, and then later in the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement. These are movements that are really important. I myself come from a pietistic background, and they have both those traditions have made so much good. But there has been an emphasis on the personal walk with the Lord, which is extremely important, but at the expense of thinking and relating your faith to all of reality. There has been this tendency to emphasize the personal walk with the Lord at the expense of the full picture that we have in the Christian faith. And I think it's really important for us that we don't move in the direction of Platonism or Buddhism, and that we do not bring with us the weakness we can see within Pietism and Pentecostalism and Charismatics, which is often there. I'm generalizing, of course. In order to remedy this, I think the best way is to start where the Bible starts. The necessary biblical starting point, and that is creation. That is how the whole Christian story starts. And we need to take the perspective of Genesis 1 and 2 as the foundation for us here. So, unfortunately, we often discuss Genesis 1 and 2 in relationship to evolution and Charles Darwin. Can I ask you for a moment to just delete evolution and Charles Darwin from your mind? Because we are not trying to relate this text to those issues. We need to look at what is the theological implications, what is the worldview implications of these texts, regardless of Charles Darwin and evolution. We are missing out a lot of good content if we're just thinking about these texts in relationship to modern science. The main emphasis is actually on something else. So, chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, what's happening? God is creating the universe, He's creating the earth, He's creating biology, all the biological diversity, and as the high point, we are created in the image of God. Now, what is God's thought for us? What is the meaning with our existence? Well, we are created in the image of God, so we should reflect who He is. He calls us to multiply. That is, to live in family, have children, express ourselves sexually, and to subdue the earth. To explore this reality He has created. And there's God's blessing over this. God blesses the human being. Chapter 2. An added perspective. In chapter 1, we don't know how many people are created. It's just, if there were 2 or many, it's just sad. God created human beings into His image. We don't know where on earth, what place. But in chapter 2, the text kind of zooms in. Okay, there was a specific starting point. There were 2 individuals, a male and a female, and later on they are becoming named. And the text is telling us something about how God created us. From the earth. And the specific thing is that God personally formed human being, and then, as one commentator formulated it, God kissed the human being to life. He was breathing life into us. A very intimate, personal event. And then God placed the man and the woman in the garden with a task to work it and keep it. And then to enjoy everything in the garden, except one thing. But the main command is, eat of all. Enjoy it, what's here. And then to give names to all the animals. To investigate the biological diversity and try to understand that. And then themselves to live in a loving relationship of unity and commitment in marriage. Now, there's not one hint in Genesis 1 and 2 that we should have our direction towards something else. God is not saying, I placed on earth, now I want you to try to come to heaven. Not one signal in that direction. He's not saying anything about placed you on earth, now I want you to sing worship songs only. It's an extremely broad perspective. I've placed you here on this earth. Subdue it. Live in the garden, work and till it. Enjoy all the fruits. The picture we have is not of God placing man there, and then God being at another place, and then God saying, I'm calling you to me, but I'm over here. The whole picture is God creating humanity, and then God walking with human beings on earth. Being with them in their calling to work and till the garden, to start a marriage, to explore this earth, to enjoy the fruits. Now, we all know about chapter 3. The first humans rebelled against God. They were driven out from the garden. And God's creation, and the whole picture is shattered. Things has gone terribly wrong. But God decided, and had already decided, not to leave human beings on their own. He could, of course, have chosen to create a new universe and start anew with a new couple. But He didn't, because He loved His creation. So God decided to win His creatures back. And that is what the rest of the Bible is all about. Now, the key thing here is that we need to connect what is said about redemption, about salvation. It needs to be connected to creation. Redemption is about the restoration of creation. And I think maybe the clearest way to show this is to see how the two terms, the image of God, the term image of God is used. Adam was created in the image of God. Adam and Eve was created in the image of God, the first couples were created in the image of God. But they rebelled, they fell, and they lost their glory. The glory they had from God. They could still be called the image of God. It's happened in Genesis 9 and in one place in the letters to James. But now they are destroyed. They do not have the glory of God any longer. Then Jesus Christ enters planet Earth, and he is called the image of God. In 3 places in the New Testament, Jesus is the image of God. In Colossians 1, Hebrew 1, and 2 Corinthians 4, Jesus is the image of God. For the first time since Adam before the fall, someone is walking on planet Earth and is really the image of God, reflecting truly who God is. And he comes into the world and he shows us who God is, and above all, he takes away our sins. He dies for us and opens the way for us to come back to God. And then the goal for people who are cleansed by his blood and are given a new life, the goal for that life is to be restored back to the image of God. Again, at 3 different places in the New Testament, the goal of sanctification, the goal of the new life, is said to be the restoration of God's image within us. So that the original intent of the creation is coming back. That we are meant to be in his image. This perspective means that the Christian faith is an affirmation of all our life. Like in the garden, the first human beings were called to use all things God have given to them. Emotions, mind, will, creativity, intuition, everything. And they were to explore every dimension of reality and think about it and start to think God's thought after him. In doing that, and even though things have gone terribly wrong now, that calling is restored in Christ. He wants us again to be fully image bearers of God. So, as someone has said, Christ did not die to make us Christians. He died to make us human. So to become a Christian is not something new. It's the really original. It's coming back to the original thing of being human. I like what Francis Schaeffer said. All of life is spiritual except sin. Spiritual in the meaning of related to the God who has created everything. All of life is spiritual except sin. So now you see the contrast between what my students wrote on the wall, limiting spirituality to very few things, which has nothing to do with this our ordinary daily life of getting up, making breakfast, go to work, care for your family, think about music or literature or whatever. But this view says that everything is related to God. So, this was a long background, but I think it's important for us if we are going to see the Lordship of Christ over all of life, and therefore the Lordship of Christ over our minds. We need to have this perspective that Christ is coming into the world in order to restore. Redemption is a restoration of creation and the original life. This means for the Christian mind that it's not thinking about Christian themes and subjects. A Christian mind is not to think about our systematic theology or church or evangelism only. Of course, we have to think about those things, and they are really important. But the Christian mind is not limited to Christian themes or Christian subjects. The Christian mind is thinking about anything and everything under the sun from a Christian perspective. And as far as Revelation helps us, thinking about things above the sun. But the Christian mind is to think about anything and everything from a Christian perspective. It's basically about thinking God's thought after Him. We do live in a creation. So this world had first been in the mind of someone, of the living God. He was thinking about creating a world. And he decided to create a specific world, namely this world. So this world has been in his mind. And then he realized that thinking into a real world. And now we are here, and our calling is to start, if we can, to think God's thought after Him, to discover, going backwards from this world, to see if we can know what God thought about this. I think it's very helpful to learn to think in a number of steps. So when we think of any aspect of this reality of human life, we should start to think about, can we know what God intended with this originally? What was in God's mind when He created this? Do we have any clue about that? Secondly, what went wrong with the fall? How has sin affected and destroyed this area? What is the sin aspect we see here? Because we will see sin aspects everywhere. And thirdly, the redemption through Christ. What does that mean? Can we know that? In the light of Christ and His salvation, how can this area be restored? Very often just partially now, before He returns. But still, how can this area move in the direction of Christ? So you think from creation, the fall, redemption, and maybe even you can think of the fullness and when Christ is coming back. So we can structure our mind here. Abraham Kuyper is he was a marvelous personality, theologian and thinker, but also the prime minister in the Netherlands and many other things. He is very famous for this sentence: there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. We can see in the New Testament that we have this perspective. In Romans 12, Paul is saying, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. He's not saying offer your soul or your spirit. Offer your bodies. It does not exclude the heart or the soul or the spirit, but offer your bodies, your physical existence to God. This is your true and proper worship. In the Greek, it says logikos. This is your logical worship. This is the rational way. This is the coherent way that you offer your whole existence to the one who's created you. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good and pleasing and perfect will. In 2 Corinthians, he says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. In order to do this, and here I am just using the points from Andrew Fellow's outline. So lastly, this Christian mind who covers all of reality because we believe in creation and in a Savior who is restoring this creation. This Christian mind must be subjected to Christ's teaching in His world. It needs to be a biblically informed mind. Otherwise, it's not a Christian mind. We need to follow Christ, and we need to follow His Word. And we know the will of God and the mind of God to the extent we can do that through His Word. And therefore, a Christian mind is formed by the biblical teaching. The Christian mind is passionate about truth. We cannot ignore truth or put emotions and truth, experiences and truth as opposites. We need to be passionate about truth in all areas of life, not only related to Christian doctrines, but relating to every aspect of life. And therefore, the Christian mind is universal in its scope. It is not only interested in the soul or in religious stuff, it should be interested broadly in everything that relates to God. And this is God's creation. And therefore, everything in God's creation has some relationship to God, because everything comes from Him. Let me end this by reading John 1, which makes this connection between creation and salvation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then it goes on to talk about John the Baptist, who prepared the way for Jesus, and then the Word of eternity, the Logos that always had been with God and through which everything is created. That Word, that Logos, became flesh and made His dwelling among us, and we have seen His glory. And then we follow in the Gospel of John how this Word, Logos, is also the Lamb of God who opens the way for us back to God.